All right. Hello. Welcome to Gaytriarchy of the seventh month, and it is July. Happy 4th of July weekend, which is almost over, but I had fun during it. I hope everyone did too. And we are here with Dr. Patrick Lockwood, who is I hate saying this because I'm sure you've kind of heard this before, but I don't think it's like actually accurate because this guy is completely insane, this fictional character. But there is a fictional character that you might sort of remind me of.
Okay.
Do you know who? Could you guess?
No, not off the top of my head. Sorry.
Okay, you're a little bit like Niles from Frasier.
Okay.
But he's insane. And you know what really bugs me about that show is that he is supposed to be from Seattle, but he's not like any Seattle, like he's the least I mean I don't know if there's anyone like that anywhere, but there's no correlation to people who are like that in Seattle. Seattle's very touchy-feely, postmodern, passive-aggressive, feminist type, and he was just like pretentious. He was basically like a weird, pretentious British man from a weird British comedy or something. So, yeah, that is my issue with him. But yeah, ultimately, we are with a real doctor of psychology, right? And so therefore we get to flood him with questions trying to not even self-diagnose, but diagnose from afar all of the people that we've ever found irritating. So it's going to be really, really awesome. He's going to know everything about them. So just put it into the chat. Tell him how your stepsister annoyed you last week, and he will have all the answers.
Sweet. I'll be just like Frasier then.
Yeah. So yeah, and if you're just getting here, which everybody is literally because it's like been going for about less than 5 minutes, hit that like thing so that we get recommended in the algorithm, because of course I am a dramatically shadow banned channel. So if you like people like Tim Pool have taken to telling everybody to share the videos, blah, 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 blah. But it's true. If you want, a fun chat and everything, post it on your social media. And with that, everybody give a round of hellos and that type of a thing.
Well, hi.
Hi, co-hosts.
Are they there?
Yes, should be. Hello.
Hello.
Okay. I'm gonna turn. I always have to turn you up, Lordy. And Spacepan, are you actually back from the coffee making expedition? He will be in a second. He said he can hear. Okay. Well, even if he's not, I suppose we can start talking about things. So I guess the best question to ask initially is, you have a YouTube channel, but as I understand, you're actually practicing. Like you've made a point in your videos to say that you're just kind of on YouTube because you feel like it could be beneficial, but you're not necessarily, you wouldn't, be particularly disappointed if your channel got deleted tomorrow. So can you explain your position, your angle from coming at YouTube and what inspired you to do it?
Sure, absolutely. Well, I think there are probably a number of motivations for me being on YouTube. And I think the primary motivator was the idea that a lot of people were getting either junk science or were getting a misrepresentation of all of what the literature would say about a given topic in psychology or human well-being. So news articles would come out, as they often do, on this study that just showed up or that study that just showed up. And they'd say, this is the brand new thing that's totally true. And this is how we should kind of deal with people because this is what this one study says.
Oh, is an example of that when they said that actually, despite, however many decades and decades of psychological studies, the male and female brain is exactly the same because this one study said so?
Yeah, there was one review that came out probably 2 or 3 months ago. I don't think it might have been Scientific American. I don't know which journal or online platform it was, but one of them had a renowned researcher basically say that there's no such thing as the female brain or male brain, which is again a fairly unnuanced statement from a scientist. And
Yeah.
that's disappointing. So that's the kind of stuff I was trying to kind of right the ship about whenever I started posting videos a couple years ago. I was like, what does the science actually say about humor? What does the science actually say about, how to maintain friendships, etc., as
Okay.
opposed to the homespun wisdom that we all grow up with and what the news says.
Hmm.
That was one big factor, and I think the other big factor was I saw people, like Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson and many, many others who were having all these wonderful conversations online with people, and I was hoping that I could somehow, some way, parlay some credibility into a conversation with thoughtful people because I just like to learn. So any conversation I can, I'll probably jump on.
Well, that's wonderful. I think that one of the true signs of somebody who is not even just on YouTube, but I would say debating on the internet at all, is that they are genuinely searching at all times for the truth. They, like even when you enter into a conversation with somebody who's kind of fully brainwashed and is wrong about essentially everything, because the way that I would see the current political landscape and socio-political landscape is that in order to really, really side with what is the left right now, which to me is a conglomeration of multinational corporations, the Democratic Party, the academic establishment, and all of the feminist stuff, which is it all works symbiotically with each other. In order to really, really, really agree with some of the things they take most seriously and are the real staples of it, like the idea that women are at a disadvantage legally or systemically in our society. In order to really swallow that stuff, you do have to have some level of brainwashing. But even when I'm entering into a conversation with somebody like that, I accept the fact that I do have things to learn from them, and sometimes sometimes I definitely get short of patience. But at the same time, it's like I don't like being wrong. I don't
Yeah.
like saying something that's untrue. If I say something that's untrue, and even if it's just small, I will try to correct myself. Like sometimes I actually make entire videos correcting myself, and just about like one or two details because I don't want to say something untrue again. It messes with my credibility as an individual. So, yeah, I like the sound of that. Keep it honest.
I try. Yeah, I try. Yeah. Sometimes I fail. Sometimes I have bias, and I tend to try to own my bias whenever it shows up in a conversation or in a Twitter conversation, whatever it is. But I try to just have a handle on it, even though I don't always succeed at that.
Huh, okay. That is cool. So, oh, by the way, I forgot to mention this. I do have my Streamlabs open. So in case you're one of the people that remembers the fact that my entire channel was demonetized for reasons they literally didn't tell me at all. I didn't even get an email. Just go ahead and I will post the Streamlabs link in the side chat, and also I will change it so it's in the video description. So, that help me out, ask some questions. We would really like that. So, Lordy, immediately, I'm curious, is there anything that is in your head, in your mind, that you would like to say off the bat to get conversation rolling to an actual healer type person who's a psychologist who is functionally bisexual, I guess is what he sort of said to me. Not that that really makes so much of a difference, except for it kind of does for the context of our stream. What would you say?
I'm curious to understand more about Patrick, your interpretation of the political spectrum right now.
Okay.
Yeah, your perspective.
Okay, so I have a couple of perspectives. One is the idea that and this is probably the kind of the cheap idea of the two. One is that our use of labels is kind of hurting us at this point, and we need to abandon that. So that's the easy softball idea that we can kind of tear apart if you want. But then the second idea I have about our current political spectrum is I think the vast majority of people, especially in the online world, are somewhat deceived, even self-deceived, I would say, about the, let's say, level of distance between themselves and people with supposedly a different ideology. I think if you were to corner most people that you would consider your opponents into a room, whether you're left against a right or a center against the right or against the left or whatever you describe yourself to be, um, whoever your opponent really is, I think you would find that if you really were to have a conversation with the vast majority, not all, because there are some radical people like, you know, Antifa folks and the kind of Proud Boys kind of mentality people who are definitely on the radical end and who might be difficult to have an actual conversation with.
Oh, I had, sorry, gotta insert myself because I actually know Proud Boys. Proud Boys are totally conversational.
Which is great.
Yeah, it's not like the left where they will just flip out, threaten to beat you up, and block you. Proud Boys are actually like they want nothing more than for people to hear them out.
Okay, fair enough. And that could be my misconception based upon limited exposure to them. So that's perfectly fine too. I'll own that right up front. What I would argue is that at the political extremes, I guess if you want to call it that, the more liberal you are, the more conservative you are, at some point you will run into closed-mindedness. I still think that the vast majority of people within 2 standard deviations from the middle are probably reasonable enough and will have a conversation with you. So I think
agreed.
Those are the two kind of thoughts I have about modern political life culture.
Okay.
Now, how do you feel about the difference between people's ability to have conversations about the politics that affect them directly in their own towns and cities and municipalities versus the way that international trade and relations is portrayed through the media, in which most citizens feel like they have no direct influence over that or even understand how it operates at all?
Let me see if I got that question correct, because I think I might have lost a little bit. So you're asking what is my assertion or set of assumptions about people's ability to understand, let's say, micro issues in the political world and how that translates or connects to like larger global political and economic issues? Is that the question?
Well, because you say that it's really that we can have conversations with each other and and probably find that despite our labels, we have a lot of similar ideas.
Mm-hmm.
When people come together to talk about international politics, they have no base. Like most people have no basis of truly understanding what happens at that level. And so when they come together to have discussions, it's usually from a very uninformed state, but very impassioned based on whatever their party line, happens to be.
Could I, Patrick? Could I maybe give you an example that might help clarify this question? If you don't.
Yeah.
Okay. So, for example, one of the big things that we're dealing with in terms of pop culture, social media companies, and corporations is that they use all of these cultural conceptions that have been embedded into our collective consciousness since ultimately, I mean, they've been working at it since before World War II, really, with the Communist Party of the United States, which I've studied very extensively. I have a whole video about it called Intersectional Feminism is Communist Particle Board, and it's an hour long. So, it really gets into the depth of things. And that is, the women's movement that was specifically within communism is where what we now call feminism came from. It is emerging between classical feminism and this Marxist utopianism mixed with women's issues, like an emphasis on women's issues above all else. And that's what we're dealing with in terms of feminism. And when you start to look at how these companies like Google, and Google's just a good one right off the bat, because I imagine you've heard about the recent controversy with them censoring people.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the thing is about Google is that they have all of these moral and ethical standards that they use to jurisdict their platform.
Mhm.
And ultimately they do stem, they go in line with the communist ethos, and specifically the feminist communist ethos, to the point where you can easily trace how these things are directly related. And so you try to explain to someone, like, look, even corporations are trying to at least emulate communism. Like, they're trying to be like that. And then people who are true believers in the left say, what are you talking about? A corporation could never be communist. Corporations are trying to maximize profit, and so they can't be communists. And it's like, well, ultimately, you're right. I don't think that these corporations are interested in giving up their wealth and sharing it evenly with all of the world. But what I will say is that there is a faith-based, essentially religious underpinnings to all of the ethos that these companies work with and create their rules with. And so it's almost as if they are using communist and feminist dogma as a marketing strategy, and they do it both to get votes and to police their platforms and to make people think that they're the good guys, because it's remarkably effective. But if you try to there's just saying that to the standard, Women's Day marcher, there'll be like about 5 things that you just said that she'll think that you're actually insane.
Wow. Yeah, I think in terms of, our level of ignorance to how things work and different theories, economic theories work, and how the world as a whole works in terms of, the different socio-political movements across Europe and Asia and Africa and all the different kind of interrelated variables that might make it hard for someone who is just on their back porch in a small town somewhere like where I grew up. I think most people, to address Lordy's question pretty straightforwardly, are pretty ignorant overall. And to a degree, I think that makes perfect sense. Most people don't have much of an interest, I would say, in international politics. And secondarily, my experience with people is that we're not really designed well for international politics, simply because we don't have much of, I think the word that was being used in a conversation with me earlier today was bandwidth. We don't have much intellectual and emotional bandwidth for, or if you believe something like Dunbar's number, about 150 people. You can't care for 7.5 billion people if your intellectual and emotional bandwidth is 150 people.
I always thought it was 300, but I mean, 150 wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah,
Maybe they have a really big heart.
Number as well.
Wait, Spaceman says something. He hasn't talked yet, so.
Oh, I just said maybe if you have a really big heart, then it's 300.
Yeah, there you go. Exactly.
Okay.
So, yeah, no, I don't know. I think it'd be very difficult to have a really astute conversation about international affairs, economics, politics, whatever, when, most of our information is overly filtered, and we really have, most people, I have some friends across the seas, but most people don't have many actual friends across the seas. So they don't really have an idea of what it's like to be over there.
Mm-hmm. But
I would like to just say that I've heard of this idea as well. And when I was studying media, it was openly talked about that if you were in the news media, if you were speaking about international or basically any kind of non-local news, you had to personalize it. You had to find some kind of way to localize it. Otherwise, ratings would go down.
Okay.
Yeah, that's actually helps with what I was about to say, because I think you're definitely right in that people don't have the bandwidth to even be able to track proper context along with the interpersonal things that they can directly relate to. And in order to really do that, you have to be very, very into doing that. You know what I mean? Like that has to be a primary focus of your life. Like for me, it's easy to say, oh well, you can do it. It's cool for it all to make sense. But even just being the YouTuber of the level that I'm at is very much intellectually a full-time job. Like every time I hear something that supposedly happened, which sounds very, very shocking, I have to do a search and find multiple different accounts of this thing and make sure that I understand the proper context of what was really going on. And so that's not just me being smart, that's me having a lot of time and, you know, an actual specific focus on that in my life, wanting to to embrace a holistic worldview if I best can. And where I'm seeing a lot of problems, and tell me if you agree, is things like the situation on the border. The situation on our border is horrifically complicated. You know, it's like Obama was doing worse things to the detained prisoners, or detained asylum seeker clash prisoner slash not class the people who are either seeking asylum, who are attempting to enter our country illegally, and even others who are actual criminals. You know, Obama was treating all of them worse than Trump was, and then it amounted in an ACLU lawsuit, which is definitely worth knowing about. And the Democrats have obstructed ways in which people could help the situation at the border in multiple ways, like really absurd ways, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez telling people to boycott this one mattress company because of the fact that they were selling mattresses to the cells, you know, the Center for Border Patrol housing facilities or temporary detainment facilities. And when after a while, after she had said boycott the people selling mattresses, she also complained about the fact that there weren't enough mattresses, things like that. And so when you start learning about all of that stuff and like the societal pressures, like it seems like the Democrats really do want as many illegal people crossing the borders while claiming that they're asylum seekers, which isn't at all a fair representation of them. They're mostly economic immigrants. That just becomes so complicated, but then it becomes familiar to our lives when we see the photo of the crying little girl, and you know, not just a crying child, but a crying little girl. And even though she wasn't separated from her mother, it was just a time that she happened to be crying at the border around the immigration officers. That image was put on Time magazine, and then every true believer in the left, you know, like every middle-aged soccer mom feminist who genuinely embodies feminism as their religion, they saw that and they said, we need to help this little girl and everybody like her because that is the feminist thing to do. And that is all they really knew about and all they really cared about. Would you agree with the dangers of getting into that type of what's the word? The type of presupposed morality that is dramatically attempting to influence and manipulate these bigger cultural happenings?
I think there are a lot of, let's call them snap judgments that people use for sure, which are built on heuristics and stereotypes and biases. And because, you know, we are designed, from what I can tell, and to act in the world in such a way where we utilize the least amount of resources if possible so that we can, you know, operate efficiently. Of course, we're going to kind of be intellectually lazy and use snap moral judgments when it's like the border or Donald Trump or any other number of other incendiary issues, for sure.
Okay. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that we are on the same page about that. Um,
Now,
so
I'd
yeah,
like to add on the topic that the House Republicans, Mitch McConnell, passed a $4.5 billion humanitarian aid bill with a huge majority vote.
yeah, it
Um,
took a long time for the Democrats to get on board to admit that they needed to do this because it would help the people at the border.
and that bill essentially silenced their ability to use the argument that there is not a humanitarian crisis. I
Oh.
mean, right? Because now you have a bill that says we just gave them money for a humanitarian crisis.
Mm. So it's proof that it's a real problem and they can't ignore it anymore.
Yeah, but
Exactly.
they're certainly trying. I like it. It's almost never getting headlines that they actually folded. It's kind of funny.
Mm. That's
Yeah,
interesting.
and you'll notice that at the Democratic debate, they just casually ignored the entire topic and decided to have that ridiculous opening with the whole the gun policy opening with the Parkland shooting. But then what people don't realize is while even though they opened with their, typical gun reform rhetoric around the Parkland shooting, that very same day,
Mm-hmm.
the sheriff from the region announced that they had terminated the employment and were seeking charges against 3 deputies who had been charged and convicted of negligence
Mm.
on the job because they had failed to confront the gunmen despite having the opportunity to do so.
Wow.
And so while they're talking about gun reform, what they're not paying attention to is the fact that that Parkland shooting could have been stopped by 3 or 4 different police officers who failed to do anything. It had nothing to do with gun reform.
Well, that's interesting. That's a topic I don't know much about, and I'm feeling as though we are approaching getting into like a almost like a partisan political argument fest or something, which is what I would like to avoid. Like I know where I kind of fall on the spectrum, but I definitely we're interested in pointing out the complexities of all of it. But I kind of think that we got in agreement about the complexities. So what I would want to know more about at this point is directly, you had mentioned postmodernism and predominant strains of I guess discourse being involved in the mainstream dialogue, and how as a psychologist these things were kind of awkward to you. Is there anything that's recently been bugging you that you would like to just throw on the table as a complete subject change?
In terms of, a postmodernist view on things.
Sure.
Um,
And yeah, things that are just doesn't I guess things that are widely discussed and yet you feel are dishonest, and I'd like to know why, basically.
oh, okay. Well, so that's tough for me to answer just because how would you say it? Um, the level of dishonesty from different groups of people in the political world and in the corporate world is almost unmanageable at this point. So I've taken a stance on current events and how would you call them? News stories. That is something to the effect of, unless it randomly comes across my desk, I'm not going to pay attention. So, in terms of this week, I don't think there's anything that's come across my radar that is particularly bad. I saw an interesting article about someone was saying embrace. I don't know. It's hard for me to formulate. There was some article I recall I saw on Twitter about dropping Western values so that fat shaming can end.
Oh, I saw, yeah, or maybe I watched your video and you talked about that. I don't
know, but I think maybe it was Godsod who reposted it or something. But
yeah.
it was very weird that they linked Western values with fat shaming, because that doesn't make any sense
Yeah, it's like
on its
correct.
face.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but if we're gonna tally up all of the obese people on Earth, I think most of them are gonna be part of Western culture. I'm just guessing.
Yeah, exactly. And part of the problem is Western values support obesity, and part of Western values shame obesity. So the part of Western values that supports obesity, whether it's kind of a libertarian attitude towards, do whatever you want to do as long as you're not hurting me, kind of thing, can result in people taking excesses, etc. But then the part that shames it, kind of the corporatist view of body image, like let's only promote the image of women that's very, very fit, or men that's very, very fit. Because again, naturally, we're all oriented towards symmetry, and we're all naturally oriented towards what generally the society describes as beautiful. So if consumerists, capitalists, not capitalism in general, but the consumerist brands, the crony capitalist brands of things, really take advantage of our natural tendencies towards beauty, etc., then of course there's going to be this resurgence of people who struggle with anorexia and other eating disorders and binging and whatnot. Like that's a perfectly reasonable critique, but all of Western society has nothing to do with obesity. Like the vast majority of Western values have nothing to do with obesity.
Yeah, there was a great little meme made. Do you know who Anita Sarkeesian is?
Not off the top of my head.
Okay, well, she was a really big deal on YouTube because she was the main cultural warrior. Like she was an actual social justice warrior, and she, in about 2014, had a series called Tropes versus Women, where she pretended to be a game critic and then called every game sexist for every reason she could possibly think of, even reasons that literally didn't apply, because she was actually lying about the gameplay, because it turned out that she was a fraud. She hadn't played these games. So she was looking at images of people having played them and streamed them on YouTube, and deducting what she thought was going on when it wasn't actually true.
Right.
And then everything, it was all the fault of patriarchy. It was all the fault of patriarchy. And there was this great image of her, and it had somebody holding a mass of Christmas lights that were all tangled up. And she had the head, she was the person holding it. And it said, "I bet the patriarchy did this." And it's kind of like that with this Western thing, and as relate to fat shaming, it's kind of like, oh, I bet Western culture did this.
Right, and that's kind of nonsensical, because to blame one set of ideas for a very large and diverse group of people's behavior is really kind of insane.
Yeah. Well, and especially within like all of this contradictory behaviors within it. Like there's so many people in Western culture, both who are trying to get people in shape, and then there's the more classical Oprah Winfrey approach, where it's like it's okay to love myself for who I am, and there's a whole industry built around fat acceptance, and there has been for a long time. People act like it's new, but it's not. I remember it from the 90s.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's true that a lot of these industries exist, and there's a profit motive for, even in my world, there's a giant profit motive for helping people, get better or whatever. And so there are lots of bad actors, and bad actors always find good opportunities. It's very easy for a bad actor to find a good opportunity because people are legitimately suffering. So what will end up happening is, people can make money off of that.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. I mean, it's very, very easy, I think, for anybody to identify real problems, and especially ones that nobody really knows how to solve, and then come as the Pied Piper that is maybe going to solve it in some way. But you just might be making it up as you go along.
Yeah, a lot of that out there. I mean, we've seen a lot of that with the supplement industries. We've seen a lot of that with, the kind of landmark forum style industries.
Oh my God! I know what you're. Yeah, yeah. Sorry, keep going, and I want to talk about landmark forum. Actually, I'm going to be away from the computer for a little bit, so just co-hosts, busy the conversation. I'll be able to hear you. It's just that I'm going to be distant from the computer for the next 3 to 5 minutes.
That's okay.
So yeah, Landmark Forum, I just say real quickly to get the ball rolling, is this, it actually used to be something else. It's rebranded itself more than once, and it was a conglomerate of based upon a cult. So there was this thing in the 70s called EST, and I don't remember what it stands for. Maybe Dr. Pat might remember what it stands for. But it was basically a way of psychologically disarming people when they're together in a group to get them to have some sort of emotional camaraderie with each other, and then masking that as genuine self-help and genuine self-progress, and then becoming evangelical with it and trying to get more people to be like that. And I did actually go to an introduction. The introduction is free. It's kind of the advertising mechanism. You convince people that all of your friends and family need to be involved in this in order for you to be happy. And so I had this friend who's a really nice woman, and she's a very good friend of mine, that was a little bit, I guess, gullible in this way. So she convinced me that I needed to go out for the introduction. She thought I wasn't going to do it, and I was like, "Are you crazy? Of course I'm going to go to that." And then I went to the introduction, and then I was like, "Yup, it's as crazy as I thought." So I didn't sign up, but yeah. Why don't you elaborate on that kind of thing if you can?
Sure. Yeah. I don't quite know the history, so I don't know if I can speak on that. But what I can tell you from my experiences of people I know who've been through it is that they find that they have a new sense of purpose, which is great and all that. And some of the principles are a little outdated and also a little overly simplistic, so you can't really make much meaningful progress from what I can tell. So, the idea that you can have what's called an enrollment conversation in the Landmark Forum world is, it sounds great on its face because we have this natural understanding that we can, let's say, convince or at least encourage people to think something that we would like them to think based upon our natural ability to converse with people. The problem with that is it's not as black and white as really, let's say, fully enrolling someone in an idea. But then they also have somewhat reasonable sounding things like, being open to possibilities. And there's basically no sector of intellectual thought that thinks that we shouldn't be open-minded. I've even started reading Medina's book, Epistemologies of Resistance, and as much as the critical discourse analysis world and the critical theory world has just become this very toxic and nasty group of people, there are thoughtful people like Medina who do really want to see what an open-minded approach towards oppression really is, and what does that really look like, and what really are the voices of people who have been oppressed, and how does their narrative have meaning that is unique from people who have not been oppressed. It's not to say that there is something perfectly, let's say, much more valuable or less valuable. It's just that they have a perspective that people who have not had those experiences have. So that's a reasonable statement, even though there are tons of extremely unreasonable kind of modern critical discourse thinkers and critical theory writers, social justice people, etc. But he's of the kind of reasonable sort of them. So the same thing can be found in Landmark Forum. There are reasonable principles and reasonable people, and then there are tons of very unreasonable principles.
Yeah, well, what I found particularly alarming about the Landmark Forum is that, you're right. There is, underneath, I would say like over 95% of ideas, philosophical concepts that ultimately stem from postmodernism, and also the weird fusion between postmodernism and Marxism and feminism and stuff, like, which are very, very closely intertwined, no matter which type of philosophy student would try to have you believe. Like, all of the postmodernists, basically without exception, were Marxists. The only one who wasn't was Derrida, but Derrida did write an entire book called Spectres of Marx, which was basically Marxist apologetics. So all of these people, like 95% of them or so, are doing the whole Pied Piper thing in some way or another. Like they're trying to offer some superior knowledge, when the point is that, like, the only good point is that we should be open to new, potentially superior knowledge in places that we wouldn't expect, but don't expect it to just happen all the time, because, you know what I mean? Like, you don't just say that this happens because of this reason. You have to actually make sure you actually find the superior knowledge. You don't just get to call it that. And that's the problem I run into. But with the Landmark Forum, what they did with the whatever the introduction thing was called, like, I don't remember what you called it, but they tried to make promises about learning things. And what they did is, one of the things that when I first went in, they wrote 3 intersecting circles, like a Venn diagram. And they said, this circle represents the stuff that you know. This circle represents the stuff that you don't know. And those were like medium-sized circles. And then they made this huge, gigantic circle that filled up the rest of the whiteboard. And it said, these are the things that you don't know. You don't know. And it's not like, that was by no means a revolutionary concept to me. It was just kind of like, yeah, duh. And then they were like, Landmark Forum will teach you the things you don't know. You don't know. And I'm pretty positive they even said, and if you don't take Landmark, you'll never learn those things. And I was like, okay, I get it. You guys are nuts. This is a scam. So
yeah, no, that's particularly unhelpful, I think, because anyone can learn anything, pretty much. I mean, with the rare exception of certain intellectual limitations, the average person can understand some things with less granular detail, but the average person can understand physics. The average person can understand calculus. The average person can understand any number of ideas or concepts if they're just either properly motivated or it's explained to them in a way that they can understand it. You don't have to buy any seminar. Like, that's one of the reasons that I basically don't have any kind of financial incentive behind my YouTube stuff that I do, because I don't, A, the money is not what's important to me, and B, I just want people to understand from whatever I think to be true about what the science is, the state of the literature is. I just want people to understand. And I think understanding is something that we come by freely, so there's no need for me to charge for it, essentially.
Yeah, I didn't start like monetizing my channel until about 9 months after. But at that point, it's like I had well over 5,000 subscribers and it was getting very regular views. And people were like, "Why don't you monetize your channel? I would, give you super chats and things like that." And so then I did eventually. But yeah, no, I mean, very, very much agreed. If you can, ultimately, we're in a period right now with the information age revolution where we are, the tools of the information age have been around for a little while, but we're just really getting to the point where we're using them purely as necessity, as our primary form of communication. And while we're in that period, I feel like the most important thing to do to even selfishly, is to differentiate yourself as somebody who gets it, is thoughtful, is open-minded, and wants to be a part of the newer version of the collective conscious. And I mean, everybody has to make a living, but ultimately, like, if you prove yourself on the internet as somebody who really, really understands things and people remember you, that's going to make a lot of difference in the coming years, I think. And sorry, now I'm really going to be muting myself, so I would like, just for the record, Spacepan, I am calling upon you to field questions because you are the philosophy guy here in particular. So I will be away from the computer at this point for about 5 minutes.
Okay.
Oh,
I
sure.
just wanted to,
Yeah, go ahead.
sorry. I just wanted to interject real quick on his point about how I've had recent conversations with minors recently, like adolescents and preteens, who have spoken about their aspirations to create their own YouTube channels
Uh-huh.
as like what their goals are in terms of how they want to cultivate themselves. And it's really interesting to me how YouTube has taken such a precedence in the lives of the the young budding intellectuals.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that a lot of young males are very interested in YouTube and interested in learning for sure. And um, I would say that good luck to them because, the, given the fact that they're younger, they'll probably have a much easier time than myself, kind of playing the game correctly. And they probably have much more free time as well. So good for them. Like if I welcome as many voices as possible, or at least that's my attitude towards the experience with, Twitter or YouTube, whatever the social media platform. I think the more voices, the better, even if they're voices we don't like, honestly. It seems to me that young voices have something unique to say, older voices have something unique to say, and we can learn from them. It doesn't mean that they're perfectly correct or that even their points make sense sometimes. It just might mean that, their counterpoint or their other idea will allow us to either refine what we know or solidify what we know in some way, shape, or form. So I totally welcome that. Anyone who wants to do it, great. It's a tough game, but it's totally doable, especially if you're attractive or funny. And if you're both, God bless you.
Yeah, that's my attitude towards people who like to use YouTube as a platform to say whatever they say. Like that's what I do. Is I have a humble little channel and I like to just say what I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, and to encourage other people too, to kind of tell people, a lot of people who make their things on YouTube, everything is very clean and very polished. There's a lot of editing, and then people look at that and think, oh, well, I could never make anything like that. So
Yeah.
then it kind of has a silencing effect. So sometimes I kind of make things that are, I mean, I would say deliberately, but no, they just turn out that way. Just kind of crappy sometimes, where I look at it like, oh, this isn't really perfect, and I'm like, well, whatever. Let's just let it out there as it is, and maybe somebody can see that and be like, I could make something better, and that'll kind of encourage them to make something too.
Yeah, totally.
Ooh.
Yeah, and I would say that the average person who is, making a channel on YouTube and trying to play the game, there's a necessity to have like a nice logo and do all the formalities of editing and whatnot. And I think that's great. I think if you want to play the game and you really want to like get in there and create a unique appeal, I'm all down for that. For where I'm at in my life and for the amount of emotional and intellectual free space I have as a one-man band, I don't have the time to video edit. I don't have the time to do anything. So I just come up with a script and get some resources together and I go live every Sunday. I don't have any of the time to do half of what most people do. So I just go live and just record it. And if I fuck up, cool. If I stutter, great. If my hair sucks, whatever. It's all good. Don't care. Just as long as the ideas get out there. That's kind of my main, goal.
And I was watching one of your videos. I think it was the one you're going through an article about transgenderism, and the beginning of it, you're like kind of
Oh, yeah.
fiddling around with the mic for a while. So I'm like,
Uh-huh.
oh, I'm in the good part of YouTube where where I think someone's gonna say something kind of valuable because they haven't fussed so much with the production.
Yeah.
And it was an interesting video. One thing that you had kind of made very clear in it that I really appreciated was a lot of people in like, I guess the IDW sort of sphere, they look at the way that there's this new policing regarding pronouns, and then they say, oh, look, it's the transgenders taking things over. But you point out, there's such a small part of the population that that can't possibly be the dynamic. It's obviously, a lot of people kind of worked up on their behalf who are kind of creating this momentum. And it reminded me of what's happening kind of with gay people. And it's kind of a little bit of what this podcast stands for, is to kind of show to people that gays aren't necessarily this this monolith, right? That there are gays who maybe are more focused on men's issues and maybe aren't really pro-feminist, because I think that there's kind of a similar dynamic, especially when you look at Pride and everything, that you're seeing this growing number of gays who are saying, that they don't really, this doesn't really speak to me or make any sense.
Yeah.
And the beautiful thing is also when you have when you know that it's a one-man band or, kind of thing, you also know that you're getting more of a direct idea of what that person really thinks. It's not so much of a by committee, situation.
Yeah, I mean, you get, and this might sound somewhat arrogant, so forgive me, but I think of all the people that are online, there's probably no one who tells the truth more often, would be my guess. I consider myself more honest than people like Jordan Peterson.
Oh,
And
well, that's not a very difficult bar to cross in our estimations, I would say collectively, just for the record.
Well, maybe
Fair-
you
fair
just
enough.
haven't slain the dragon yet and saved the mother under your pillow or whatever.
Yeah.
Jordan. I
and
love
then, and
Jordan.
then realize that it is all connected to Jesus. You just don't know it yet.
Right. And again, I really do love how nerdy he is and how effortlessly he interconnects ideas in a way that is meant to make sense. And I really appreciate that about him. I agree that there are meta narratives and structures to how humans function. I would say I would disagree with him that it's religious in nature or spiritual in nature, and say that there's this meta principle like a meme from Richard Dawkins that unifies us, and a collection of memes probably organized into another superstructure above that we might call spirituality or whatever. But I think our collective ethos based on instincts and how we're designed is a better way of looking at things than spirituality and God.
Yeah, very much agreed. Like, I believe actually using the word meme is actually very important for the way that I view my own vision of cosmic spirituality, if that's what you would choose to call it. I believe that anybody who's made a profound impact in meme form throughout history, like Jesus, Buddha, Muhammad, they have become this almost godlike spiritual entity because their ideas have lived on throughout hundreds and hundreds of years.
Yeah.
And so it's like, I'm one of these people that is like, okay, is there a specific God out there? I'm not, definitely not willing to say that, but I'm willing to say that there are veritable godlike entities floating throughout our collective consciousness. But I do think that they fade over time and that there's sort of new ones. And I don't know if those entities are conscious or if they've entirely left their consciousness behind. I don't know where they go afterwards, but I do think it's a fair representation to, call these things sort of what they are, and to give a little bit of merit to what Jordan Peterson was saying about, Jesus. I just don't think it all leads back to Jesus. I think there's many other factors.
Yeah, Jesus is just one of the many archetypes, I guess you could say.
Well, and if you were to say this to Jordan Peterson, he would say, well, what do you mean by Jesus? And what do you mean by leads back to? Right?
Yeah, I know. What do you mean by God?
What do you mean?
Yeah.
You're trapping me. You're trapping me.
Yes. That's the point of conversation, Jordan, is to figure out what people really think. And we have to use conventional language games to figure out what people think.
Yeah, and the thing is, I could have that conversation with him, but it would be deeply personal and it would go on for a very, very, very long time. And if it was anything like what happened when he did it with Sam Harris, he wouldn't really seemingly try to totally understand where I was coming from. And that's what sort of bothered me about him when he had that conversation with Sam Harris. Have you seen that?
Yeah, the two-parter where he gets lost in the word truth for an hour and a half with Sam, and then the second part where they try and just put it to the side.
Yeah, it seems very intellectually dishonest to me, which is one of the things that's made me ultimately very skeptical of him. But I just wanted to say real quick, because when I was away before from the computer, Spacepan was talking about the authentic side of things that tends to come out when people are approaching things humbly and just trying to get their innermost personal thoughts out. And when I first started my channel, I was definitely that. I was terrified of people even hearing my voice because of personal circumstances of me knowing a lot of people and feeling like maybe I could be recognizable. I was a little bit more paranoid than was ultimately all that necessary, though. No, I'm very glad I've stayed as cautious as I always have been. But when I first started out, I was making entirely, you know, like the first 5 or 6 videos of mine that I made were entirely text to speech. And so it had a robot voice and slideshow, and that's all it was. And one of the things I find very endearing about Derek, aka Spacepan, aka the one with the yellow, is that we had met online during that period, and he actually always really liked those videos from me. He likes the robot voice for whatever reasons. And I when I actually switched and started using my own voice, apparently he was almost a little bit disappointed because he appreciated that quality. And I even have my early videos about why I appreciated that quality. Like, I liked removing because of the overt emphasis on identity politics and standpoint theory, and this notion that anything anybody says cannot ever in any way be divorced from the fact that they are a white male or something. I was trying to defy that, and, you know, just see how universal I could make things. And you know, it's cool when people totally get that.
Yeah, it's great when we feel seen and understood by people.
Yeah.
It's a neat story how you guys found each other.
Yeah, and I like to find people in that regard as well. You know, like, I'm very eager to have people come on this show that just seem very interesting to me. And, you know, it's cool if they fit into the sort of standard focus of this show, which does tend to be amplifying the voices of gay male dissidents. And but at the same time, you know, I do find myself watching channels that I definitely would have never thought, you know, like I never thought that the whole MGTOW thing would make sense to me. But then at certain points, there were heterosexual men who found people that were directly related to this podcast and thoughts about disowning the LGBT community and things like that. And they found a way to relate it to MGTOW in a way that seemed very honest and applicable to me. And I found that very interesting. So I've been a lot more sympathetic to MGTOWs ever since then, even though it's not really something that ever really occurred to me to focus on, and because I have no real reason to, because I am a gay man.
I see. And what exactly does MGTOW mean? You'll have to forgive me. I'm not very hip.
Spacepan, would you want to handle this one?
Yeah, sure. So it's kind of an umbrella term, but it stands for men going their own way. And within that, a lot of people have different ways of defining, I guess, to what degree someone takes that, or even in what manner. For example, there was a big conflict within MGTOWs about whether or not a married man could be considered MGTOW. But it's basically men deciding that they don't want to get married, and in some cases, men deciding that they want to avoid having contact and avoid having relationships with women. And the reasoning for this, on one level, has to do with the way that marriage laws are very, very stacked against men, and the way that family courts are very unfair, and the fact that you know, even if reform were something that was kind of in the cards, we still have a history in America where, you know, through like no-fault divorce, a lot of marriages basically get grandfathered into this new paradigm of the way marriage works. So it's basically men kind of basically going on strike. And some men, I think most men within MGTOW, you know, they'd prefer not to. Like, they'd prefer probably to have kind of a more traditional life and a more traditional approach towards women. But they're just recognizing that right now, the only way that they can really protect themselves is to kind of distance themselves from women. So they're kind of reluctantly a part of it. But then there's also an aspect of it where people take it to a degree of kind of like focusing on yourself and kind of letting you see yourself as an end in itself, which isn't really something that's promoted for men. I think that there's a phrase in kind of the manosphere that we say women are human beings and men are human doings. And it's that men are always kind of valued for their utility, and they're often seen as disposable until they're just kind of used up and then thrown away. So with MGTOW, it's sort of a way of saying, the fact that I'm in danger, it matters here, and I should, value my own self to some degree.
I see. Yeah, I can understand why people would identify with a movement like that, because, there is a lot of relative chaos in the dating world. There are a lot of, like, I heard an example the other day of a young man who was literally recording on his phone with a voice recorder feature that someone consented to have sex with him. And I was like, wow, that's where we've arrived at in some cases. It was kind of surprising to me. So I can understand why there's let's say, a counter movement with all of the fear and the reactionary, like the accusatory, men are bad, men are dangerous rhetoric that exists in the online world and even in the real world to a degree. I still always wonder, and I don't have an actual answer, especially not a coherent one, but I really do wonder about, how these online movements like MGTOW or MRA or even Antifa to a degree, I wonder how all these things, not that they're the same, but I wonder how they all, like, they might grow a lot online, but I wonder how much they really kind of transform into real life, behavior, right? I really wonder how big MGTOW would be compared to what it's like online, because it's safe to, pick a group that's radical when you're kind of hidden behind a microphone like I am or whatever it is. But when you're in the real world, do you act out those principles?
No, absolutely. And there's a lot of people who, they might say, like, in private, people like, hey, like, I think that what you guys are saying, like, it makes a lot of sense. And I'd really love to non-anonymously state my support for it, but I'm afraid because I might have consequences for my career or something. With MGTOW, it's a little bit different, though. With MGTOW, they have a phrase, don't show your power level, which is basically that in the real world, you don't go around supporting MGTOW in a very flamboyant way. It's more just kind of the secret, very subtle sort of a distancing, because the point of it is essentially self-protection. So in a traditional sense, it's not really like a movement, right? It's more of just, I kind of think of it as defense against the dark arts.
Okay, wait, but I just want to insert something real quick, because this idea of don't show your power level, that has been used by the worst YouTuber on the platform. And I don't mean worst as in most uninteresting. I mean just the most horribly, elaborately, calculatedly dishonest YouTuber on the platform, which is ContraPoints, who's extremely awful. And I don't know if you've ever watched those videos, Patrick. Okay, so ContraPoints is one of these people that has probably single-handedly done more to contribute to this culture of complete and utter paranoia coming from the democratic corporate leftist and even progressive establishment, to popularize this notion of dog whistles, which is supposedly there's actually Nazis everywhere you possibly go, and they're saying things and doing the OK symbol, and it's all just a dog whistle to signify to each other that they are secretly Nazis. And one of the things that ContraPoints pointed out in a video, which was saying that, like, because one person on 4chan, one anonymous person said to other actual white nationalists or whatever, which, I'm very much not. I'm very much not that. This one person said, yes, when we talk about, I'm paraphrasing, but they said in the post something like, when white nationalists, that's what they were saying, talk about these type of issues, don't make it obvious that we're talking about them to other people. Hide your power level. Make sure that you go undetected, which, that's a very universal term. And the reason why is because it came from Dragon Ball Z, which was an extraordinarily popular Japanese animation cartoon show, which had a transfer, a crossover to the American audience in the late 90s. It was one of it and Sailor Moon were the first two Japanese animation series that brought over all of their episodes, and very, very, very many episodes, seasons of them. And in the case of Dragon Ball Z, it was released as if it was a soap opera, like you found out something new every day on the channel. And so it got very exciting. And what was cool in Dragon Ball Z is that they all had superpowers, and they could literally hide their power level and make it look like they had computer devices which would read how powerful an enemy was, and then they could hide it and trick them. And so I've actually used that completely as any sort of tribalistic signifier. Like, I have never, when I first said that, it never had anything to do with any subculture or anything. I was literally saying, I'm smarter than I sound, hide your power. And it was my Twitter bio. And it's just kind of a joke I do where, like, I realize that I kind of sound like a 14-year-old drag queen, but I don't really care to sound overtly pretentiously intelligent. I kind of like when people underestimate me in a certain sense, and that's all I was saying. So I just want to push back on that little notion and saying that is a nuanced one. It's not just MGTOWs who say that. It's not just, it could theoretically be anyone, because in my case it was.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that at all. Yeah.
Sorry, it was more of a correction to what Derek just said, not anything about you, but.
Oh.
Well, and Patrick, in response to your question, the idea of what goes online, what's discussed online, and what happens in people in the world outside of perhaps more organized discussions of power. I like to think of, like, let's say in what we're doing, that we have like a small circle of people relatively. If we were all to be in one room together, we could all fit relatively nicely, and including the people who are also in the chats and observing. And there's a discussion going on, and we like to talk, about, you say like dissident ideas, but like basically, we try to unfilter ourselves. And I like to think that we then go from this place out, and each person goes from this digital place out into the world, and is knowing that they're going into a separate space. It's a different room, it's a different context, and so that they're going to be applying the new ideas into this other context, receiving information from that environment, and and then coming up with another idea from there, right? Because they are actually balancing two totally different spaces and environments. Like both would be affecting each other.
I would call that, simply put, code switching. In terms of the way you speak, like I do, I'm a pretty honest person in real life, and I only hang out with a select few people in real life. But when I do end up, if I go over to the holidays with my mother's neighbors, which there are several because she lives in a whole community, I have to code switch a lot in terms of, like, realizing that all of these people have the presupposition that Trump is terrible, probably that it was a fluke that he won the election, that his supporters don't even like him, that he's doing everything wrong, and things like that, which I would have a lot to push back on. But I go with the intention of realizing that, like, I can't just say certain things. I have to slip in little truths when there's something that's easily corrected, and just being like, oh, well, it's actually not true that he just decided to separate children from their parents to be cruel. That had to do with an Obama era ACLU lawsuit where the ACLU sued Obama because he was holding women and children in adult prisoner facilities on the border, and the ACLU sued him in 2014. So eventually some compromise was made. And I'm like, isn't that interesting to know about? I can show you the ACLU lawsuit from their homepage, and just little things like that without being like, yeah, actually, just so you know, I kind of think the Democrats are dramatically worse than the Republicans, because they would never expect that from me. My mother's neighbors remember me as this gay kid that was like 14 that wasn't really out of the closet at the time, like, so.
Yeah. I think, code switching is just another, I would conceptualize it as camouflage from the evolutionary kind of psych defensiveness world. Yeah.
Yes,
Absolutely.
absolutely.
That's perfectly fine. I mean, a lot of people, many people who are agreeable or who don't feel confident in their ability to withstand circumstances because it is such a hostile and volatile world, probably code switch on a regular basis because they, don't want to have any censure. They don't want to have any criticism. They don't want to engage in any conflict with people because they're either exhausted from the conflict or, they don't want to lose their job or whatever. I happen to be someone who is just very disagreeable, number one. And number two, I have no shame. So I will say whatever seems to be true. And if you don't happen to like me for it, that's perfectly okay because it's not said with any malice in the first place. And if you're reading malice into it, that's totally on you. And I'm happy to talk with you about that because I'd rather you feel better. But there's no part of me that holds anything back because life is just short. That's my experience. I'm just so tired of any degree of playing games. I have a very little time that's free and available, so I want to use it as authentically as possible, which means occasionally people not liking me, which is fine.
Yeah, that's awesome way to be. That's generally my way of being.
Put.
It only changes around people like my mother's friends.
Yeah, right on. No judgment. It's perfectly reasonable, perfectly understandable. Yeah. Most people do not want to cause conflict with people. I just happen to come from a family background where conflict was the norm.
Yeah. Well, it was with my family. It's just she has friends who aren't actually like that. So
totally normal.
Yeah,
totally reasonable.
Yeah, no, what I'm saying here is very much I respect and am in line with your position. And it's wonderful for you that you can live a life where you don't have to make exceptions in that way, because I'm so close to being there.
Right?
Yeah,
no, absolutely. And it's been a process for me to get here, but I don't regret it at all because what I found is that I have more freedom the more authentic I become. I have more freedom with my patients, with my friends, my family, everyone. My life is inherently 1,000% better overall. Just I know that sounds astronomical, but it's a much better the more I just said what's on my mind.
When would you say that you started doing that? Like, was there a specific time period when you realized that you were being socially pressured to be dishonest in a great capacity that inspired you to actually end up consciously moving past this? Because that's one of the things Jordan Peterson actually talks about, and I very much agree with. It's like the best thing about never lying is that you never have to remember your story. Like, you never have to remember the lie. You can just always tell the truth and you'll always end up be fine. Was there a moment for you?
I think there were a collection of moments for me in the past 15 years. I think probably some of the bigger moments include the moment where I started meditating, in a very consistent way, where I noticed that when I was able to just kind of sit with an experience in my head when I was meditating or afterwards and let it be what it was and not have to push it away, not control it, not see it differently, not misperceive it, just let it be accepted and let it move on. I started to see how useful that practice was in real life with a person. I could kind of non-judgmentally interact with a person and everything got way better because there was more truth being told. We understood each other, which basically is it's like half of what we want to do when we have a conversation or we're physically close with someone is we want them to understand where we're at so that we can feel seen. Feeling seen is a major requirement for any relationship. So I got to feel more seen. The people around me got to feel more seen, and it was better. And I was able to let go of, some of the desire for vitriol that I'm perfectly capable of, because I knew that that was more of a defense mechanism and less of an authenticity thing. So the meditation thing, which happened with me back in undergrad, was probably a really big time. And then there was another time when I was in therapy where we had a couple of back and forths with my therapist, and she really was able to push me and help me shift a mindset about vulnerability that I was very, very helpful. So I think those are probably the two bigger moments in my life. There probably have been hundreds in between.
Okay.
Yeah.
That actually reminds me of something you had mentioned, I think towards the end of the video you did about love, which what was that this new, or maybe no, maybe it was on the transgender pronoun one. Those were the couple I had watched, but you mentioned that this tendency to kind of censor and shut people down is really, really counterproductive, because even if someone is saying like the worst things you can imagine, you're not going to put them in a good space to develop or to grow or to learn anything if they don't feel like they're heard.
Absolutely. It's impossible. We cannot grow. We just can't grow if we don't feel seen and heard and understood. It's impossible. I mean, anyone who understands developmental psychology, anyone who's had like an undergrad developmental psychology class knows that's how kids develop. And that's how adults develop too. We don't, just because we're magically above the age of 18 does not mean that we don't need a sense of nurturing, a sense of understanding, a sense of care and concern. That doesn't magically disappear because you're an adult cognitively or something like that. And that's the only way we can be challenged. We can't be challenged if we feel terribly unsafe. We have to have a relative level of unsafe and then a relative level of I'm safe and I'm okay. That's where Vygotsky comes up with the concept of the zone of proximal development. We need to be pushed 10 to 15% outside of our comfort zone in order to thrive. We can't just stay in it, but we also can't be so wildly overwhelmed with feeling uncomfortable, unseen, unheard that we can't converse or get to a solution.
Yeah. That's one of the problems. I think you really articulating the mechanism of social interaction that becomes difficult for me around leftists and feminists, because their entire worldview, I'm going to say as a rule, because the exceptions are so few that they're kind of not worth mentioning, like they are very much exceptions to this rule, is based around a religious, faith-based presupposition of reality, in which the left and the feminists are those who are fighting for the little guy, which means primarily women, and then from all women is the starting point from all of things, but then racial minorities, sex and gender minorities, lower class, blah 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 blah. But women are always the victims. Like, women are always the revered people who are the most important according to the left. And when you form your worldview in that way, the standard way of viewing things, this is what I was like up until 2015 when I started actively criticizing feminism. And this is what everybody I've known are like. And, I mean, hundreds and hundreds of people who are definitely like this. They genuinely believe that anybody who would even challenge these, what they view as incontrovertible truths, like the idea that women are oppressed in society, anybody who would even question whether that or not that was true, they just don't understand yet, according to them, that women are oppressed. And it's really, really hard to tell these people, like, look, I grew up raised by a feminist mother. I was born in, the early 80s in Seattle. And I lived in the city limits of Seattle. I went to a crazy alternative high school, which was as far leftist as you could. Like, this was in the 90s, had a teacher that was a Marxist and things like that. I went to a university in New York City, the New School University, which is about as far left in the division that I was in, which was the writing liberal arts, social sciences type division. And it's about as far left as you can get in New York. And I lived in the San Francisco Bay Area for 7 years. I get everything so much that I realized it just didn't add up. And then I had to start challenging it. And I try to even get into that story, and people, and all I do is get to the part where I'm like, well, yeah, I grew up, I had a feminist mother, and they're like, so you had mommy issues. Okay, well, you know, not every woman is her mother. And it's like, whoa, okay, you just don't, you know.
Well, you know, it's shifted though in SF now.
What?
Because when I bring up this idea of like women aren't oppressed, they're like, outside the US they are. Now what they talk.
Oh, well, that's another convenient excuse. Yeah, even though they never do anything to help those people. That's just
Right.
another dismissive tactic. And not even, I would push further on that. It's not even just that they don't do anything to help these women. They don't even understand what exactly the issues are. Nonetheless, the intricacies of issues facing women in other places, like how much worse are they in your estimation off than the men living under Islamic societies? Because you know, I'm not an expert on this, but a lot of people would say that men have it equally as bad. And what are the specific things that, you know, because these people defend Islam so much, why are they doing that? What are the things that they would want to preserve about this culture if you're going to be cultural relativists? What, you know,
it's so convenient to forget that in a lot of the countries where women are required to cover themselves, men are also required to grow out their facial hair.
Yeah. By the way, if you haven't hit like or consider donating to Streamlabs donation, but now would be a good time. So sorry, I just kind of tangented us.
There's actually a topic I wanted to bring up. It kind of touches on a few things that have been brought up. And what it was in your video you made about love. One thing that it reminded me of. This kind of goes back to MGTOW. A lot of people within MGTOW, they argue that male and female love is actually radically different. That and it has to do with the way that people's brains are, and it also goes back to this idea that that basically women will love men for their utility, but that this like agape, like unconditional sort of a love. Many people argue, I guess many people like within maybe the more extreme circle of MGTOW would argue that only men have that, but because they want that from women, that's the source of a lot of this conflict, is that they're not being realistic about their expectations. And I just wondered if, I know there's kind of a lot there, but I wonder if you have any
you can
thoughts
put
on
that in
idea.
context. You can put that in context of women, in the fact that for a woman, if she is barren, then she basically has lost all worth, right?
Right, but we don't see an epidemic of men just like divorcing their wives the moment they're no longer able to, you know, to be fertile, right? Like they hang on to their wives even afterwards, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think it's a very complex topic because the first thing is I don't know what definition of the word love would be being used by any of these people. I would say that most people on average are talking about a sense of care and concern, which is a sense of you are important to me emotionally and or logistically speaking. And you can't disentangle the one from the other. You can't just have a pragmatic relationship with a romantic partner. There's always a sense of care that's elicited by that person, whether they're barren or not. So I think you can't get rid of that because we have a natural instinct towards care as a species. And I think in terms of lust, yeah, it's totally easy to drop someone or let go of a relationship, male, female, straight or gay, whatever, if they don't activate that sense of like euphoria and curiosity. But the sense of caring is one of those things that we're all searching for in all of our relationships, romantic or not. And I think it'd be very, very difficult if you're a part of this MGTOW movement, as it's called, to really feel, let's say, satisfied if you don't have some kind of partner or pair bonded mate, even if it's not a perfectly, monogamous relationship. That's my take. Pair bonding seems to be the norm across all species that are mammals. Now, every species cheats, even geese who have really good PR, but the vast majority of all species will pair bond if given the chance.
Right, and I think that the way that you kind of reconceptualize it of I think you had three parts, but you said care, concern, and then I think lust was like a third component of it.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So I would differentiate two different kinds of, let's say, what we describe as love. There's a sense of care, concern, and commitment, and then there's a sense of lust, which is a totally separate thing. So care, concern, and commitment are care is definitely an affective, motivational quality. Concern is an affective, oh shit, are you okay? Are we okay quality? And then commitment is a cognitive, like verbally, etc., described agreement between two people about the nature of their relationship. So that part is something I was doing to just kind of rebut against Sternberg's model of love. But then the lust part is intertwined with the sense of care, concern, and commitment, but also separate from it as well, because we can fuck people that we don't care about to a significant degree, but we also want to engage in sexual congress with people that we care about because it's part of what helps us feel close or cared for.
In regards to just that care, compassion, concern dynamic, what I would feel, and this is, I'm just curious of your interpretation, is that both men and women are biologically predisposed to, partner up and give care and compassion to the people that they have had any sort of serious relationship, and definitely that would include a lot of the people that they lust for. One of the problems that I'm seeing is that due to the dominant cultural narrative being built around this feminist thing, where it's you always have to prioritize women's needs, or you're always encouraged to. There's the "Don't Be That Guy" campaign, and in Canada, where it's about, like, if a woman is too drunk, you should never ever have sex with her, and things like that, which is, it's not a totally unreasonable point, obviously, but at the same time, I would say that in basically every way, in the contemporary feminist discourse minus these very few exceptions, like minus the Christina Hoff Sommers of the world and stuff, there are very, very overt messaging of actively telling women not to care about men in these ways. Like the emblematic example of it in the cultural ethos that it stems back to is patriarchy hurts men too, which, I phrase my version of what that really is usually, well, it's a dismisser. It's a silencer tactic. It's basically just patriarchy hurts men too, man, baby, is the kind of thing that they are implying as they follow that up. And that's one of the reasons I think that feminism is so damaging. I think that women not are only not being held accountable for the ways that they don't care for the men in their lives, often they're very often their own children. They're basically told, that you're more important than your child because reasons, because feminism, you know what I mean? Like, it doesn't matter that your child should be probably seeing his or her father recently if you don't want that to happen. Things like that. I feel that it leaves this morality, this self-enforcing morality gap among women who fully embrace this mentality. And then men either pick up the slack as best they can, and just learn to accept the fact that they are constantly shamed while women are never shamed, or they go full MGTOW or something, which I don't think I think even MGTOWs would say they wish they didn't have to be a MGTOW normally.
Right, and I think that line in and of itself speaks to the problem, and it speaks to how illogical the behavior is to a degree. I think it does no one any good to give up on the concept of a relationship. Now, there are certain relationships which are absolutely very, very toxic. You know, I've worked with a number of them clinically and professionally. That aside, it's not like that's the only relationship you can ever have. You can form a pair bond with a number of people over the course of your life. So I think giving up on relationships altogether is more of this kind of almost peaceful protest kind of thing, which, again, totally reasonable, totally understandable. I don't think it serves people at the end of the day. But I can totally understand why. Because if you're afraid or you're tired of being demonized, at some point we're going to say, fuck you.
I would say maybe it doesn't serve people at the end of the year, but it might serve people at the end of the day.
Right, absolutely. That's a fair point. Yeah, I mean, it might have a practical purpose in the here and now. However, you know, long term, you are losing on a sense of care and commitment that might be useful for your mental well-being overall.
Yeah.
And the challenge of actually finding a good partner is a worthwhile challenge. I mean, that in and of itself is extremely meaningful. And even though it might be very arduous and very confusing, it's still a worthwhile challenge that will make that ultimate relationship much more meaningful. Because it's like no big deal if you randomly meet someone on like a Tinder or a Scruff or whatever. And it's great if you meet and everything goes happily ever after, but it's still, there's something to be said for the seriousness and the confusion of meeting someone in public and not knowing who they are and if they'll like you and what will happen, and then maybe getting their number and then maybe going on a date, and then how is it really going to go? All that is a different kind of like game than meeting people online. And the game of meeting people in person, not that online's bad, been there, that's okay, but meeting people in person and the serious challenge of actually meeting someone is a worthwhile challenge. It actually helps you feel empowered once you see that you have the capacity to go meet someone. And put yourself out there and face the rejection or the confusion of the relationship.
Yeah, yeah. And I feel, have you heard much about this concept of the gay loneliness epidemic? It was written about on Huffington Post, but that's one of the only things that Huffington Post got at least partially right. It is a big problem. This notion that gay men are sex addicts, drug addicts, and grinder addicts, and massive amounts of suicide and lack of actual connection, which I definitely feel is a big problem. Now, Huffington Post went in a dramatically incorrect direction, in my view, when they said that they feel that they basically just said, well, ultimately, like, why is this for gay men? And then they said, well, it's because gay men are men and they have to deal with other men, and men suck. It was basically the conclusion that the Huffington Post drew from it. But I would say that the problem is definitely there. I would say that there's a lot of layers. And one of the things that I think is really left out, which is one of the big reasons that this podcasty live stream thing exists, is the notion that gay men are horribly robbed of their ability to have anything of their own due to the profound and totalitarian intersectional feminist monopolization of their own communities. Gay men are told, no, you cannot have a male-only space, that's sexist. No, it's not cool to not be interested in having sex with vaginas because you should be open to having sex with trans guys. They're told that they can't date according to who they're attracted to. Like if you're a white man who's attracted exclusively to black men or mostly to black men, you will be accused of racist sexualizing. But if you are attracted to primarily white men, you will be accused of being racist for not dating Black and Asian men. There's this so many rules that gay men have to go by according to these standards, and the really ultimately self-defeating thing is that these are standards imposed by women. Yes, there are gay men working on behalf of this ideology, but this ideology all came from women who feel perfectly entitled to order gay men around, often because they will say, well, I'm a queer woman. I deserve my right to this space. But what queer really means to them is what I call bistratual. They're really a woman who is mostly dating men and doesn't have any aspirations in the way that she actually thinks she's going to have sex with gay men. And maybe she calls herself non-binary, but, is a straight girl, And I find gay men are at such an odds with making these cultural connections because they have to go through Grindr, because they have to go to a bar where everybody's drunk, maybe trying to do drugs and everything all the time, and they aren't allowed to be themselves when they're at the bar because they have to walk on eggshells worried about breaking these intersectional rules, which in Seattle is a really big deal. Like, you can't say certain things at gay bars. Like, they will catch you and they will get mad at you. They will overhear your conversation and try to potentially even get you kicked out of a bar for just talking about how you think vaginas are disgusting loud, and that's perfectly fine. It's like, look, I don't expect a straight man to look at a picture of a male butthole, even if it's a really, really hot man with a, well cleaned, well shaved butthole. I do not expect him to not think that that's disgusting. I accept the fact that me being willing to lick this thing makes me hormonally inclined to do so, but it's not because it isn't gross. I accept that. But you can't say those type of things about female genitalia. And there's all these things that have been beaten out of gay culture when gay culture exists. And then it just retreats to Grindr, which isn't a culture at all. It's just vices. That's all it is. And that's something that I'm viewing as a major, major problem for gay men. And so I guess the question would be, what are your views about how the gay male community is doing right now? Because I don't think anyone feels it's going well. I was just watching this Vice kind of documentary thing where they had various members of the LGBTQIA++ community or whatever talk to each other, and it was about 12 people, and literally all of them agreed that they do not feel at home in the LGBTQ. And I haven't talked to anyone who's said, yeah, this feels like a home to me in years. Like, there's not a single gay man who's going to be like, oh yeah, this is totally comfortable for me. And then all of the, non-binary, asexual, trans, female, people or whatever, they're all going to say, well, yeah, it's all cis white gay men that are, dominating this space, which doesn't mean dominating. That just means the majority of the numbers. But then all those guys are miserable too. And yeah, what are your thoughts on that in general?
Okay, that's a big question because
that's why I made it so long with the intro. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. It's totally okay. Let me see what corner of it I can bite off here. So the first thought I have is, a lot of people will discuss the topic of the LGBTQIA whatever spectrum, and they'll come at it from the point of view of victim stance. And I find that inherently problematic because although it is absolutely true that internalized homophobia is a real concept, it definitely merits attention. It definitely has, long-standing social kind of, let's say, credibility, in the sense that there are a lot of people who do have a lot of shame about their sexuality, and they've lived in the closet for most of their life in many cases. And
wait, I just want to insert real quick. I do think that literally every gay male feminist has internalized homophobia.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
No, absolutely. And I imagine that their internalized homophobia has to do with the predominant narrative, I guess you could call it that, because we have lived in societies that are not particularly, let's say, kind to gay people since, at least the last 4,000 years. Um, all that being said, there's been a dramatic shift away from shaming gay people for the last couple of decades here in the country, but it's definitely true that internalized homophobia is real, and a shame-based, victim-based narrative or personality structure is going to result in a lot of aggressive ideological behavior to feel safe and to feel like you're part of a powerful group of people. And the most powerful group right now are the feminists, to a degree. That's one thought. The other thought that comes to mind for me is in terms of how well the community is doing. I think that's really, really difficult to assess because, you said you lived up in Seattle. I'm here in Los Angeles. I come from the South. So I've lived in two kinds of worlds for people on the LGBT spectrum.
Now, can I just ask real quick, when did you move to LA?
I moved to LA in 2010.
Okay, so that just from my vantage point, I was in Seattle till the year 2000, New York City till 2005, Seattle again 2005 through 2007, then San Francisco for 7 years, moved back up here at 2015. So I feel like I have a pretty good cross sampling of various different cultures and the various in terms of far leftist areas. And my perception, and this is something that would really, really basically be impossible to get me to change as anyone. And I'm not even thinking that you're going to try to, but is that the real feminist wave, like what I call fourth wave feminism, it really started around 2012 and became a dominant, a borderline dominant cultural force by 2014. 2015, it had thought it was the full and complete dominant cultural force, and now they're dealing with thinking that they are, but kind of losing power as the dominant cultural force. So sorry, keep going.
Yeah, I would agree that cultural force is losing power with events like the Walk Away campaign and all those kinds of people who are kind of pushing back against the dominant narrative there.
And them embarrassing themselves with things like Me Too, like Me Tooing Kavanaugh, which blew up in their face. So
it did, it seemed like. So, yeah, go ahead, please.
I had a comment on internalized homophobia, and it had occurred to me that hypothetically, if a gay man who, already has struggling with accepting himself, is around a leftist feminist person who is then, and let's say they're in a bubble like San Francisco, this person who might be saying to this gay man, there are radical conservatives, there are alt-right people in the world, in the United States, who want to hurt you.
Yeah, a few doors down from your house.
Right. And so, of course, what is the natural survival response? Oh, I should hide. I don't want to get hurt. I should either shield myself or I should hide, or how the leftist fear-mongering rhetoric actually fosters that internalized homophobia to want to cause gay men to hide in fear of the illusory radical right person who wants to hurt them, even though there's no statistical evidence of that.
Sure. And what I would add to that is the idea that it reinstills a sense of fear and internalized homophobia, but also reinstills a sense of victimization.
Yeah.
That it's only okay if we can view ourselves as victims in this world. And I do this with my trauma patients all the time. I help them understand that what happened to them was terrible, and there's nothing wrong with seeing it that way. And where you are right now is safe, and you're okay right now. In fact, you have power right now. You are not a victim in this moment, even though you can relive experiences of trauma. You're not currently being traumatized. Now, people might say things that trigger you or make you feel as if you're reliving a bad experience from the past, and that's a problem. But generally speaking, it's not the case that the average, person on the spectrum, LGBT spectrum, is in a significant amount of peril on most of the coast. And that's one of the points I made in my book, The Fear Problem, is the rate of progress at which things are getting better for the gay community is astoundingly better compared to most other facets of the world. So the fact that people are still up in arms and very afraid or, activist or kind of aggressive in gay culture is somewhat confusing to me. I think it's really a fear-driven dynamic of, I don't want to be victimized again. And as much as no one wants anyone to be victimized, the question is, does acting like you're under serious threat all the time actually serve you? And as we know from people with PTSD, of course it doesn't.
Yeah. And I definitely want to re-rail you on the topic of moving from the South to the LA, and how that has differentiated and changed things over the years from your perspective. But just quickly, I very, very much am in favor of gay guys getting past the victim complex. I got past it before gay marriage was even legalized. I was sick of hearing about gay marriage. I just was like, look, it's really not that bad. Like, things have gotten so much better. I don't want to live my life thinking that people hate me. And I legitimately felt that way. The only thing that I ever really talk about now is that feminists now tangibly victimize gay men and do these really, really awful things. But I feel like it's worth bringing up because it would be so easy to get it to stop if gay men just had a spine and stood up for themselves. So just be like, we don't have any reason to listen to you at all. We're gay men. We, when you talk about our internalized trans misogyny or some crap like that, it's like, no, I don't care. It doesn't apply to us. Just let us be ourselves. We will be fine. You're not compassionate. You want control over us. And then the idea is just to get guys to move on and be honest. But let's go back to your overall. I think that we brought this up in terms of the context of gay men facing the problems from sort of the new cultural atmosphere and your perspective on that.
Yeah, so when I moved from Missouri to Los Angeles, what I noticed was nothing terribly different, if that makes sense. So it's not like there was a very open and accepting culture for homosexuals where I come from, or for anyone on the LGBT spectrum. However, it was not the case that people were being harassed, assaulted, or anything of that nature where I used to live in southern Missouri and where I used to when I went to college, etc. People might still use words like fag in an aggressive way where I come from, which happens here in Los Angeles. So it doesn't seem like moving to a supposedly more liberal city really affected a whole lot in terms of openness to sexuality. The main difference here in Los Angeles that I can tell is that there's just a much bigger market for people on the LGBT spectrum, and the more liberal city has provided, let's say, more infrastructure for people who want to be openly gay to flourish. That's definitely a big difference. And I think other than that, there's not a whole lot of difference from when I moved here, even though the attitudes are definitely more closed-minded where I come from. But I haven't noticed anything dramatically different.
Now, would you say that there's a notable disparity between how much gay guys and LGBT people and everything talk about their own oppression, try to kind of like play it up and, act like Trump wants to put LGBT people in in internment camps and all that type of stuff. I guess the better way to say this is when I only was in, you know, far leftist areas, and by the time I moved to San Francisco, the reason why was because I had decided, like, I was doing music and writing theater type stuff, and I was like, you know, I always feel like I'm at a disadvantage in even Seattle because gay guys kind of aren't taken seriously in the arts because there's not that many like really good gay artists. So I want to move someplace where I'm not going to be a minority, and I'm never going to have, you know, even if nothing gets better for me, I'll never have that mental fallback option of thinking that maybe people were prejudiced against the fact that I was a homosexual. And so like I just got rid of that mindset that I was a victim. And that was my starting point. But what I noticed was that there were so many people that were just even more firmly gay activist, LGBT activist, that type of thing when I moved to San Francisco, even though they were living in the land where gay guys aren't oppressed, you know, and there's all sorts of situations where gay men are privileged in San Francisco. And I found that very strange because it was like, why it was like the land where formerly oppressed men went to whine about how they're still oppressed or something.
Yeah, I'm sure it was a very weird experience. And I think one of the reasons why it's particularly weird is because, you know, when you go to a place like San Francisco or San Diego or Los Angeles or New York City or whatever, you see that it's a very open, very liberal, kind of thoughtful city. And it should make no sense that people should be talking about how bad they have it if everything is kind of more open and more thoughtful and more accepting. Those seem like kind of incongruent ideas. And the problem is, I think that, you know, all of us living on the coasts, we get a not very representative snapshot of how the average person really feels or views themselves in the LGBTQ whatever community across the country. I think, and if you're to put it into a kind of a world perspective, it's even more different, disparate across the world in terms of how much people feel like victims, etc. And I think it's very confusing to me when I hear people say that there is a lot of outrage culture because of where I live. The vast majority of the time when I'm around people who are same-sex oriented or on the LGBT spectrum or whatever, I rarely hear any talk about politics, and I rarely hear any talk about victim stance, which could just be an artifact of the fact that I choose people who are either more open-minded, more thoughtful, or more kind of conscientious to associate with. That's entirely possible. It could be selection bias.
Do you go to bars and stuff?
Oh God, no.
Oh, okay.
No,
So yeah, I think that would make a difference because remember the 2017 Pride Parade in LA. Do you remember what that was?
I don't know. Couldn't tell you.
Well, it was significant because they just canceled the Pride part of it and made it into an anti-Trump protest.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So it's kind of like,
wow.
Well, that attitude's definitely in LA, I assure you.
I'm sure it's there. I rarely experience it when I'm at the gym, when I'm out with friends, when I'm on a hike, whatever, what have you. And I have a number of gay friends, and it never comes up for some reason.
Yeah, no, and that's great. I think that the outrage stuff, it's mainly online.
Yeah,
of course. It's basically, you know, honestly, and it's just I hate to no, I don't hate to. It's basically anywhere where the feminists can invade and monopolize the conversation. And that does include bars. They do take over bars. They take over, you know, there was a land in like a radical fairy sanctuary, which was a place founded in like the 70s or 80s, land outside of the city designated to be strictly for gay men. The feminists took it over and now banned the men that were the previous caretakers of the land, like guys who were there for 20 years. They nixed them, and then they lied about why they left, and they won't really tell anybody about why it was, and then they just call them misogynists. So it's like, I feel like gay men, if gay men are okay, gay men can't force themselves to be safe from that stuff, because once the feminists realize that gay men are trying to form a space like that, they will, as a consequence of them knowing that it's an intentional thing, they will try to infiltrate and then take it over, because they view the whole world as if anything that's not feminism is patriarchy, and patriarchy is bad. But I do think that there's spaces where gay men tend to congregate that ends up being free of the feminist influence. So like some place like the gym, where it's like, well, sure, feminist women are totally invited here. That's fine, but most of them don't really go. Also, I think that would be the case with, in a very different way, with the meth scene. A lot of gay guys end up being drawn to this very raw, masculine, stoic presentation, pure sex environment, and it's maybe the closest thing they have to male camaraderie, because there's no feminism in a bathhouse when everyone's on meth. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I do think that camaraderie is a good solution, though.
I do too.
I think the more we can actually, not to use a trite phrase, but the more we can build bridges, so to speak, between groups of people so that we can understand each other, the better. Because I think what's fundamentally lacking is a lack of understanding of where people at. No one's seeing each other. We're kind of, what did I say? I said, I was in a Twitter conversation, said we're kind of arguing at each other's groupthink.
Yeah.
That's kind of what seems to be happening. And I don't think that's a very productive form of conversation.
Yeah. Well, that's one I would pin, in terms of this dynamic that we're just talking about right now. I would pin it all on the feminists, because the entire feminist worldview is centered around this notion that if you don't understand and agree with their conception of patriarchy, then you are the patriarchy. And, it's perfectly acceptable for women to say that they understand men better than men understand themselves, because for women, supposedly they have to understand everything about men for their daily survival. And so they get to order you around all the time. That is their actual attitude. Like, I can point you in the direction of the feminist literature that directly, and very revered feminists like bell hooks, like, it's not obscure feminists that no one pays attention to. Bell hooks is the matron saint of contemporary feminism. Wow. So like, my bigger problem with gay men at large is not their inability to understand women. No, it is, but there's a very big caveat. Gay men, by and large, haven't brought themselves to admit that women have no real interest in understanding them. They don't, not women, feminist women. The feminist women who monopolize and conquest gay male spaces to turn them into feminist spaces, they intrinsically will not accept male essentialism in any way, shape, or form. They think that they can go in there and change everything due to sociology or something, and that is their mentality. And I think the biggest problem with gay men is how incredibly naive they are and unwilling to acknowledge that. And it's not hard to acknowledge it when you actually just read an entire book by bell hooks, and it's like, no, that's actually what she's encouraging her followers to do, and that is, she's the most influential contemporary feminist. So you can't really ignore these things.
Yeah.
This actually reminds me of a question that had come up in chat regarding this idea that homophobia directed at gay men is all based on misogyny.
Okay.
And then they'd asked they said we should ask you if you think there's any merit to that notion.
So let me see if I understand the question correctly, because some of this stuff is new vernacular for me. So homophobia directed at gay men is actually misogyny?
Yeah, the argument is basically that it's ultimately an expression of hatred of women because they're perceiving in men that they're acting like women.
Yeah, they're being feminine or femmy or something of that nature.
Yep, exactly.
Well, I mean, on a superficial level, that can make sense, I think. But I think if you were to dive into what some people might find detestable about males who act feminine, I don't think it has to do with the fact that they're acting like a woman in particular, because it's not that women are bad. I think it has more to do with the fact that you're acting incongruous to what you're supposed to be, right? So we're theoretically, as males, supposed to be more masculine looking and sounding and acting. We're supposed to be more calm, more stoic, etc., all that stuff. So when you don't act like that, there's a chance that you might be some version of weak and or not capable. Therefore, that means you might be some kind of threat to our lineage or our tribe, etc. Because an effeminate bad leader is someone who is going, and this is not my logic, just so we're all perfectly clear. Um, the evolutionarily instinctual approach is I need a certain kind of leader or male or whatever it is, whether it's the dominant female bonobo or the dominant male gorilla, whatever the dominant is in that culture. If you're accustomed to a male acting a dominant in a certain way and a certain kind of, let's say, stoic or whatever it is, whatever the stereotype would be, it's going to be automatically confusing and incongruent when someone is acting feminine. I think that in and of itself causes what most people call cognitive dissonance. Like these two things don't add up, so I feel anxious and weird and awkward.
Yeah. Sorry.
And I would say that anxious and weird and awkward can be dialed up to 11 for some people because maybe it, threatens their own sense of femininity or whatever it is that's also incongruent for them. So if we have an incongruent aspect of ourself that we're not comfortable with, we might see it in other people and demonize it because we don't know how to deal with our own discomfort, etc.
Okay. So this is a particular question that I've been fielding since when I first began my channel. It was actually one of the questions that started me to really question feminism, because I just knew it wasn't true. You know what I mean? That homophobia is rooted in misogyny. I was just like, no. So I had to do a lot of like really weighing the playing field of what I think is going on. And I think that what you're saying is definitely true. In the way that when I think about gay men, like a lot of the time, this accusation that all homophobia is rooted in misogyny comes from extremely effeminate gay men who are ultimately bitter because they can't get many dates. And they have the convenient excuse of saying, oh, well, it's not my problem, it's culture's problem. The feminists told me so I side with them. And the idea is, you should never work on making yourself attractive. Like the guys who fully embrace this, they're also very often totally chubby, and it's just like, well, I have a feeling that if you were in good shape, presented yourself well, because men are attracted very strongly to guys that are in good shape almost unanimously. If you presented yourself well physically and you also had a deep feeling of confidence, you can be a little bit feminine, and that's totally fine. And I honestly think of myself as living proof of that, because despite the fact that I sound like a 14-year-old drag queen, I'm actually 37, and Lordy here has met and seen lots and lots of photos of a number of the guys that I've dated in the past, or at least heard stories, sex stories and crap. The point is that I'm a person that's like kind of naturally femmy in a small way. It's not like you can divorce the femininity from me entirely. It's there, but at the same time, what I still do have is I have this innate confidence and willingness to take charge if necessary, and to stand by my convictions, to not really care a great deal. Like if I go to a bar and I'm having fun, like I really don't even think about who's looking at me at all. Things like that. And that is what ultimately, it's like, yeah, I do kind of have a little bit of a limp wrist and I sound like this, but guys don't really notice that after a while because of my overall attitude. And so I think that I guess you could call that dominance, but
well, think about it like this. I've been around, homosexual men who not only act feminine but want to be perceived as basically a woman, not necessarily trans, but they want to, they are aligning themselves with the perception of femininity and women, and all that that comes along with, right? So that it often turns to like, well, why are you asking me to take the heavy bag of trash out? Why are you
Yeah.
asking me to help you carry that thing up the stairs,
Wait, Lordy, can I finish my thought? Because I was actually getting along that angle, and then you're totally free to speak for a while. I'm sorry that this is elaborating. Because I think so the problem that I'm running into with the word dominant is that there's varying different ways to be dominant. I think that, thinking of masculinity in terms of confident, willing to state things definitively, like, no, this is how it is. This is what we need to do. Like my co hosts know that if there's anything that I think is not good for our show, they will hear about it and they better listen. And that's trusted. I trust these men very much. There's men that we have had in the past who did not quite understand that, and it didn't end up working. So is that dominance? Is that confidence? Well, I wouldn't be dominant in most situations. Here I am because it's my channel. But ultimately, females can be very, very dominant, and they can be very, very dominant in a feminine way. They can, but ultimately, it revolves around very different means to an ends. Often, like there are women who are not authoritarian, authoritative and firm. And like if you talk to Karen Strawn from the Honey Badgers, what she says goes. And there's men on the show, there's women on the show. And if she doesn't think something's a good idea, she will explain exactly why. And it's kind of like listen to her, take her orders first, ask questions later, and they trust her with that. That is generally a trait that's perceived as masculine. Fine, whatever. But women have the capacity to be extremely dominant in a feminine way. And this is what I would say is more in line with feminism, which is this notion of stopping the whole show to make everything about their feelings and things like that, which I think is what Lordy might be kind of hinting at or starting to get into. Correct me if I'm wrong. Which is that there's these gay men who decide to be very feminine, and then think that they can stop the show and like tell other gay guys how horrible of a people they are for not acknowledging that they're the biggest victim and therefore the most virtuous person or something. And I feel like that's a very feminine form of dominance. It's kind of underhanded, but it certainly exists.
Well, yeah, I think you definitely bring to a good point of this idea of what is dominance, and the false notion that women are somehow passive and men are somehow aggressive, and that's just how it lies. It's completely false. Women and men both have aggressive and passive qualities, whether disregardless of their, irregardless of their sexual orientations. So just what I see is like there are politics around being perceived as a woman and being perceived as a man. If you're perceived as a man by society, then you could be potentially drafted into to war and this kind of idea. So well, if the idea of being drafted scares you, then maybe you don't want to be perceived as a man for that reason, as like an example of these the way that um the to mark the difference between a gay man who uses femininity to try and manipulate things into the way that he wants them, rather than understanding like what you're talking about, the true nature of a woman, which is not to like, is Karen Strawn the type of woman to say like, oh no, I can't carry a box up the stairs, like,
Yeah,
she seems to be a
she's
very
the reverse.
yeah.
So yeah, I hope that didn't derail you too much, Patrick, from what you were talking about, because I was very interested in but I just wanted with the masculinity, all homophobia is rooted in misogyny. I wanted to explore the aspect of what you were saying, but did you have anything more about all homophobia being rooted in misogyny that you didn't finish?
Yeah, no, I think I said everything that I could think of at the time. It's just I can see how there's elements of misogyny there. I cannot see that that's the core issue in my mind. Obviously, I have a bias because of what I do for a living, and I tend to attribute problems to kind of psychological phenomena that are readily observable. So one of the most readily observable phenomena that everyone goes through at any given time is a cognitive dissonance. So if we are exposed to something that doesn't fit a model that we've learned or grown up with or inherited, like a feminine male specifically, then I think there's the cognitive dissonance around that. And that can be particularly upsetting for some people if they're socialized to believe that it's particularly bad that men are feminine.
Okay.
Right? So I think it's a combination of factors. I can see the misogyny thing, but I feel like that's just the icing on the cake. I think the deeper issues are the senses of anxiety and kind of ego incongruence that people face.
Well, I would say the deeper issues are actually pretty simple, and there's two of them. The fear that they are people who are men and therefore sexually predatory, which mainly manifests itself in the form of gay men being perceived as pedophiles, which is dramatically higher than even straight men. And straight men are very often pegged as pedophiles for no good reason. But gay men, you can't even think about saying that a 15-year-old is handsome, even. Like my mother had me over with her neighbors and was saying like, oh, look how handsome Joey's gotten. And I was like, you know what I mean? Like, just like, yeah, mom, don't ever say things like that to me. I can't, as a gay man, that's just something I could never say. And so there's that. And then there's also the fear of diseases.
Sure. Yeah. The fear of diseases is a real thing. In fact, one of the biggest proponents of conversion therapy was a guy named Nicolosi. And he did a lot of research that, kind of brought in the medical world and showed that things like, prostate cancer, colorectal cancer, et cetera, all these kind of serious diseases are higher among males who have, let's say, anal intercourse. And that's one of the big selling points for a lot of people who believe in things like conversion therapy is you're decreasing your chance for a risk of a serious STI or medical condition as a result of engaging in same-sex behavior, which again, to a degree is accurate in the sense that the rate of substance use and the rate of unprotected sex and the rate of needle sharing, etc., and all those other things is higher among men who have sex with men who use drugs. But that's not the root cause. It's not the sexual attraction towards a male that causes the increase in incidence of those diseases.
Yeah. So other question, and I think that we should be starting to wrap up soon because I think this has been a very interesting live stream. So I don't want it to go on for any longer than 3 hours at all.
Okay.
But this is a simple question that I imagine is going to have a long open-ended answer for you that I'll give you. I'm going to totally give you the floor to approach this from a psychological standpoint and with your own personal anecdotes as well, whatever you want to throw into this.
Yeah.
How much of an overlap would you say that you think that there is between homophobia, what we would call homophobia, the bias against gay men, and just bias against men and that intersecting thing?
Okay. That's another tough one. So my first instinct of many is that there's probably maybe a moderate level of overlap. I would say the two correlate at like 0.4, maybe, if I were to put some random statistic on it. And the reason I would say that is because yes, there is let's say a modern movement that is somewhat anti-male and it happens a fair amount on the coasts and in certain academic institutions. And I think that might definitely compound any issues with homophobia or internalized homophobia for homosexual males, and probably bisexual males to a degree as well, and maybe transitioning male to female trans individuals. I'm sure it plays a role. I don't know that the overlap is unidirectional. I would say that it's probably bidirectional in the sense that maybe internalized homophobia might make you more ashamed of being a male, and that maybe whatever, if you are in a culture that's anti-male, that probably might reciprocally reinforce any internalized homophobia you might have if you were a homosexual male or bisexual male, etc. Um, I don't know that those would be the core issues I would focus on with someone, though I'm sure if someone came into my office saying, you know, I just can't deal with this internalized homophobia anymore, or I can't deal with this shame against men anymore, I would definitely address it with them right away. I don't know that if you were to do a straw poll or maybe even a pew poll and survey all the men on the coasts or in the Midwest or what have you, that they would say those are the two biggest problems they face. But it could be the case.
Well,
I would love to know.
Well, I would say that that's because I think men have been so thoroughly conditioned to never acknowledge that there's problems with being male.
That's probably true, and that's one of the arguments that the toxic masculinity folks make, is that essentially men are supposed to kind of grin and bear all of their problems because they're supposed to be stoic, they're supposed to be tough, they're supposed to be, you know, thoughtful and problem solvers and doers, as one of you mentioned earlier.
Well, and women are supposed to be the ones with the real problems.
You're right, and they're supposed to be the ones who have strong feelings about how their problems affect them specifically. So that's definitely one of the counterpoints that the toxic masculinity people talk about. And I think as it is with most, you know, very complex topics, the truth is usually somewhere near the middle-ish, where I'm sure that a number of people that struggle with their masculine identity, because there's this outrage culture that exists that are feminists, you know, probably see that that affects their desire to be sexual or sexually active, especially if they're gay males, and probably the other direction too. It might be that their sexual orientation is confusing to them, or that, you know, now they don't know how to deal with the fact that they're a male. I still wonder out loud, freely, how big of a problem it is, or if it's more of what we've been talking about in terms of the online outrage, online shaming world. You know, I really would love to know how much that translates into real life experience, because I don't have a good sense of that personally from my life. Those are my thoughts.
Well, I feel that I do have a very good sense of that, and I think my co-hosts would agree from their perspective, at least certainly Lordy, in the spaces that I have inhabited. Now, there was a great change. It didn't used to be the case prior to around 2013 in my sphere that gay men had this shame of being male, but then that became the dominant cultural force. And now, you know, you can talk to gay men just about something like, you know, abortion, and they're just like, we need to stand with our sisters, we need to defend this is unacceptable, they are oppressed and we aren't. And it's like, okay, well, just gonna tell you right now that I don't see any, like, we don't have any inherent obligation to women as gay men in this regard. Like, we really have no reason to actually care about abortion one way or the other, just from a purely self-interest perspective. And you know, some gay men are totally pro-life, it turns out. But ultimately, we don't have any real reason to care. Therefore, what about a little bit of reciprocation? What about if females started caring about the fact that it is literally completely legal, condoned by the state, for men to have their genitals mutilated at birth, and it happens more often than not? And so, you know, I would be a little bit more keen on focusing on issues like abortion, which, you know, I'd still have to come to my own conclusion about. If women could at least acknowledge that, hey, all of us when we're born don't have our genitals mutilated. That's a starting point for human rights, period. And then gay men will say, how dare you? You are the biggest misogynist that I have ever encountered, and this is just utterly disgusting. How dare you not care about the women? And it's like, okay, Stockholm syndrome, anyone? You know, that's how I'm feeling. And it has translated directly into my personal experiences. Now, it mostly centers online, but I do think that the online world shapes the dramatic majority of explicitly gay spaces, like bars, pride parades, nonprofit things. I think that they are all run under feminist law, and the feminist law states what is important, what isn't important, and you're not allowed culturally to deviate from that unless you're in a selective environment.
Sure, and I think that comes back to the problem of victimhood and victim ideology. Again, the reason that a lot of, I would say, these gay males that you're interacting with are up in arms about abortion, protect our sisters and whatnot, is because really, as I said earlier, it's one person's groupthink talking to another person's groupthink. So there's this I'm a victim ideology or groupthink, or ethos even, in gay males, or a large portion of gay males, because they are identifying with their victimhood. And then same thing goes for women who feel like they're being, let's say, taken advantage of by the government or whomever for not being able to have abortions. So the one victim ideology relates very well. We can kind of empathically relate to the fact that we're both oppressed victims, so to speak. So
Yeah.
That makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah.
They would act that way. I don't think that it's a wise or useful way of interacting with each other in the world, but it's normal because, again, we have a very, I always say, we like to think we're more fancy and sophisticated than we are, when we're really not. We're really much more primitive than we give ourselves credit for. I talk with people like Heather Hang and Brett Weinstein on Twitter, and I say, guys, we need to start going back to owning the fact that we're troglodytes. We keep having these as if conversations as if we're really that sophisticated. I really don't think we are. So It makes perfect sense to me that people would be speaking from this very primitive, affectively oriented victim way of seeing the world and seeing themselves. That checks out for me.
Yeah. Okay. So to add upon that, I would say that gay men have been thoroughly conditioned, and this is ever since I was in high school. Like this, being a large part of like queer activist groups and the overall LGBT community type stuff. Because I would be like the one gay guy out of 15 lesbians and people who would become trans guys at these groups very often. And, these groups didn't used to be the predominant strain of gay male interaction, and maybe they still are somewhat of a minority. Like I would say that they're ultimately a minority, but they're the minority that has convinced themselves and convinced the gay community at large that they are right. So like, yeah, most gay men don't actually really identify with feminism all that much. They mostly really identify with RuPaul's Drag Race, wanting to go out to bars, get drunk, get laid, have a successful career, things like that. They're not actually sitting around thinking about abortion. But I would say that gay men do identify with female victimhood for very specific reasons, because females have female feminists, not females by and large, but there's this very, very predominant cultural ethos that has effectively affected the gay community at large, which states that due to things like the question that was asked before, which is like sort of like the gay question, as it would be, are gay men oppressed because women are oppressed? Are gay men in the same boat as women because the same people that oppress women oppress gay men, which would be the patriarchy, which would be straight men? And I think that more, like I would say well over, probably 80% of gay men actually you live with that presupposition in place when they analyze, forms of various male oppression. So it's like I noticed that it's incredibly difficult to get men to separate this notion of circumcision, which, hey, that applies to women too. It happens. Women get circumcised at birth. too, in ways, or at least at being very, very young, with something like abortion, which is entirely unrelated. We're talking about post-pubescent, almost entirely adult experience that happens, and it's like, well, no, but this is this thing, and it's women, and we're oppressed, so we have to first let them that, and it's like, well, yeah, but I mean, the underlying presupposition is that you are inherent allies because of a perceived common enemy, and how much of a factor would you say that you think that I mean, like, does it make sense? Have you thought about that much?
The common enemy idea? Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, the common enemy would be the straight white male patriarchy, which seems to be thrown under the bus quite a bit for a variety of reasons, mostly not useful from what I can tell nowadays. So, yeah, it makes some sense to me.
Spacepan, you haven't said anything in a while.
Yeah, I've just kind of been listening. Mostly I'm kind of on board with most of what's been said here.
Okay.
I mean, any other questions I can answer? I mean,
nothing pressing, I have to say, and we've had you for a while, and it's been wonderful to speak with you. So I don't want to overburden your time nor the time of this stream looking like something that people won't want to watch later. Sure. So is there anything that you would like to just sort of get out there as kind of a closing thought, knowing the type of people who would be attracted to this stream in particular?
Okay, let me take a whack at that.
Okay.
I'll do my best Jerry Springer impression. I'm glad you got that joke, because that's, it's a rather old joke now.
Be kind to each other.
Yeah, right. I mean, that's kind of the gist of it. What I was thinking was, outrage culture seems to be a big deal nowadays, and there's outrage culture on the right, on the left, in the middle, everywhere. And I've been having a lot of dialogue with people on Twitter in particular, and in real life, but mostly on Twitter, about outrage culture. And here's something that I think would benefit us all. And it's something I had my conversation with Andrea, the Canadian, the other day on her podcast. I think if we wanted to have a better, let's say, communal dialogue or discourse, there are 3 questions we can always ask ourselves. First question is, does this need to be said? Second question is, does this need to be said by me? And the third question is, does it need to be said by me now? And I think that might clean up our Twitter a little bit if we want. Now, obviously, the incendiary, clickbaity way of doing things draws attention and gets notoriety. And I know that that's not very kind of, let's say, popular advice. I will say, though, that I think if we really do want more acceptance and understanding and, let's say, social change, that those 3 questions that I've so obviously stolen from someone like Craig Ferguson, who's hilarious. And it's a 12-step thing that's been around for decades, so it's not like a new proprietary concept. But those 3 questions are extremely important for our, let's call it, online well-being. And I think that's something I'm going to be pushing for the next couple of months as I talk with people on Twitter.
Guys, closing type statements. Any things you'd like to add?
Sure. Well, what I'd like to say is, Prince, I'm glad that you had brought it to my attention, because so far what I've seen from your channel, it's really interesting. So I'll be looking forward to kind of going through the backlog a little bit, and I definitely will be keeping an eye on you. So you've gained a subscriber for sure, and anybody in the chat, I'd recommend checking out his channel, because there's a lot of little gems on YouTube, a lot of very small channels that they become big channels later, but regardless, it's you find a lot of really interesting things that way that otherwise you might never hear.
I appreciate the compliment. I hope that anyone who can will go watch some videos and see if anything helps them. My whole goal is just to be helpful. It's that simple.
Yeah, and I think I might grab a copy of your book too, because I think that I'd kind of appreciate a perspective, since it doesn't seem like you're as steeped into a lot of this like internet culture, and I think that's a problem that a lot of people within like red pill and kind of manosphere spheres we kind of suffer from, that you kind of fall down this rabbit hole, and then sometimes it's a little bit hard to turn back and see the light of like the regular daylight. So I think that you'd have a lot of insights that'd be very interesting from that perspective.
I hope so. I mean, if you get the book, please let me know. You know, send me a tweet or a DM or something and let me know what you think of it, because I'm open to any and all feedback. And if my ideas are helpful, I'd really like to know, because then I'll keep talking about those things which seem helpful, you know.
By the way, I just posted the link to his channel in the community live chat so everyone can see it. And I'm going to be including it, editing it into this video's description right now so that people who watch this later, I forgot to put it in initially. I apologize. But yeah, I agree. People should definitely check out his channel. I wanted to just say a little bit about the outrage culture thing. Is something that I really noticed, obviously, which is that when I first started out, I was very much the type of person who was my initial channel name was Common Sense Gender Network, and this was before I decided that I really was an MRA. I wasn't, trying to really bridge too many gaps with feminism, because I just didn't see too many worthwhile bridges worth being crossed, with feminism. It's just sort of like, wait, no, they're just kind of wrong in my view. But I initially started with this very trying very, very hard to be balanced and trying to, because I know so many feminists even still, and have had connections with, people who are nice, people who consider themselves feminists, but, don't really know much about feminism, but whatever, and they're nice. And then I did get to this point where my audience was growing very quickly, and due to things making listicle videos called things like 10 or 8 reasons that SJWs will never admit that they're wrong, things like that, did grow my channel a lot. And I got into the habit of this, what could be fairly categorized as outrage content. And I did do that for a long time. And then there got to be a point where I was like, wait, I need to go back to the more intellectual side of things, like sort of my roots, and not just appealing to emotions and things like that. So I eventually did that, and I think it was worthwhile. But I think that in a certain sense, it did lose a little bit of the steam and vigor in which people follow my channel, because it's kind of rare when there's something that really, really makes me mad, and I'm just like, okay, and I mean, it certainly happens, and those videos often are very popular. But I do think that, yeah, we all of us that are involved in the dialogue need to step back and have the ask those 3 questions that you are talking about.
I think it could help. Maybe. Possibly.
Lordy?
Hey, Patrick, it's been really refreshing talking to you and your perspective on victimization, and how, no matter how you look at it, it's unhealthy way to perceive oneself in their life. And and it's a hard thing for people to hear that oftentimes, especially in an online discussion or a casual conversation in a place, rather than a therapy situation. But
Sure.
but is it has been kind of my mantra in trying to just bring up the level of conversation from fatalistic to potentialities, and how could our behavior change when our beliefs about ourselves change?
Absolutely. I think that's fundamentally important. I appreciate you bringing it up, because I think if we have a more, let's say, positively oriented discourse, like, even though we've been victimized, we have strength now, then I think we change our perspective, we change our motivation, and it's easier to make progress towards, healing, towards living a healthier life, whatever the goals might be for you as an individual. So I appreciate you bringing that up. That's definitely one of my goals with this. And again, all three of you guys, if there's anything I can ever do, or if there's something you want me to answer, you just let me know, and I'll happily be a support.
You know what I would love, to be perfectly honest, is if you would consider being a semi-regular guest for a particularly applicable topic where it's like, oh, well, you know, we do know this actual psychologist guy, and it would be cool to actually talk about this thing with an actual psychologist. This won't be a particularly regular thing, but if give you a little bit in advance, like being like, hey, are you free this weekend?
Yeah, that's totally fine. If whatever I can do to offer my perspective and maybe what I consider to be a reasonable point of view, I'm happy to be a support.
You can ground us.
If I can ground myself, sure.
I think
Good answer.
I think you've done a pretty good job. I just recently meditated for the literal first time with Lordy. Lordy is doing this project that revolves around electronic audio and music, but what their most is guided meditations with shamanistic and real like a guy was his partner in this is a descendant of Mayans, and so he actually has this. So it's safe to call it shamanistic qualities to the actual music that he has, built upon his wealth of experiences with medicine festivals and stuff. And yeah, I did that, and it's the first time I truly meditated was with one of these guided meditations, and I full on started weeping and crap after about 20 minutes. And so it was cool. And I like that vibe for this moment of my life.
Nice. I dig it. I hope you all do that. Yeah. Cool.
Okay. Well, I'm just going to quickly check the super chats or the Streamlabs donations in case we got something, because I would hate to miss that while we're on air. But no, I did not. Regardless, I hope that if you guys found this, you in the audience found this interesting, that you share it around with people, because that is always good for me. People don't ever get to just see my channel videos ever, so you have to share them and everything. Yeah, and have a wonderful last few hours of the holiday weekend. And yeah, I guess I will talk to you guys soon, working on some videos and stuff.
Cool.
All right, see you guys later.
See ya.
Bye.
Bye.
Have a good day.
Bye.